All right. Quick introduction. I'm Ian. I'm gonna be the Prime Minister for Saudi government, and then I'm debating with Sam, who's
Hi, I'm Sam. I will be the member of government in today's debate from Dalton.
yeah. Um, with that being said, opponents, you ready? Judges, you ready? Okay. All right. Time starts now. All right. Quickly on top of case. This House rational actor and our framework is going to be what's best for the average American citizen. And then a quick characterization. So first of all, we regret like this specific bailout, the specific 2008 financial bailout, not the idea of like ever bailing out any bank ever, just this specific one. And then second, it's important to analyze in like a sort of this House regrets motion, like what's the counterfactual? Like what happens if the US government does not bail out these major banks? We can tell you that in like 2008, the government had to do something, and there were two, options. The first was either a systemic restructuring and breaking up the big banks, and the second was bailing them out. And so, because we're looking at the counterfactual, we're going to go under the assumption that by instead of bailing them out, we increase regulation and break up these big banks. And that brings me to our case and our contentions. So, our C1 is about moral hazard. We tell you that when you bail out these big banks, you tell them that like taking on this major financial risk is okay. It's important to look back to the blurb that's given in the motion that like it says, and this is the direct quote, banks engaged in increasingly risky behavior and they issued subprime mortgages to borrowers who were unlikely to repay. And like, I'm not, super well versed in like all the financial ins and outs, but like the gist of it is that these banks took on incredible risk. Like they were essentially like, giving money out with little to no barrier to entry to people who were never going to repay them. And they were taking, unnecessarily like stupid risks. And so what happens when you bail them out is that you tell them like it's okay. Like you can do pretty much whatever you want and we're always going to be there to like bail you out. It's important to look now, like what's the status quo of the financial industry today? Like after this big bailout happened in 2008 and set this precedent. We tell you that currently banking is ruled by the big four of, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, um, and then one other one that I forget. And they can pretty much take like whatever risks they want because they're quote unquote too big to fail. But, as we learned from 2008, no one is too big to fail, and eventually someone will fail. And it's important to look for a more direct example of this to the private credit industry. The private credit industry was another industry that in 2008 got bailed out. And now today they have like, massively grown and are doing the exact same kind of things, like the same kind of like
You know what?
risky loans. Excuse me?
You know what?
Yeah, sure.
Were there consequences to the banks after the bailout, despite the bailout?
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Were there still consequences to the banks that got bailed out in 2008, despite the fact that they did get bailouts from the US government?
We're talking more about sort of like what happened to the average person, and we're going to get to that later. But with that being said, back to the private credit industry. So the private credit industry was another industry that got, really bailed out. And today they have massively grown and are doing the exact same kind of risky loans and like poor investments that happened in 2008. And what that means is that like through this bailout, we set the precedent that it's essentially okay to sort of take on all these, crazy risky investments. And you can also look to sort of Silicon Valley Bank, which I think like collapsed, I think back in 2023, 2022, because they were, giving loans to people who didn't like really like deserve them or warrant them. What are the impacts of this, Judge? First of all, in a world in which you don't bail out the banks and you have like, actual restructuring and like breaking up these big banks, we say that you see, first of all, more banks. And more banks means more competition, which means a better customer experience, and it's easier to get. Not like if you're like an unqualified, person. And then the second impact is that like bank restructuring and like these increased regulations mean that banks don't take this massive risk, and it decreases the chance of these future like major financial catastrophes. With that being said, getting on to C2, which is about public distrust. It's important to know that the bailouts were targeted at banks, but like they did little to nothing to alleviate the financial costs on the homeowner. Like if I'm a homeowner in 2008, like regardless of like whether the banks get bailed out or not, I'm still gonna lose my house because I can't afford to pay my mortgage. And so the bailouts do nothing to help me in that respect. And you can see this because in the status quo in which the bailout occurred, there was mass people there's mass what's the word foreclosure. There was a mass foreclosure on the U.S. homeowner because people couldn't afford to pay their mortgages. What does this mean, Judge? This means that when the US federal government like chooses not to like help the average person, the everyday American, which is what we want to frame this debate around, and instead they choose to bail out, like these big banks, like major banks, keep in mind. You see
What?
first, excuse me?
You know what?
No, sorry. Um, where was I? Oh, sorry. We say that the 2008 financial bailout leads to sort of a rise in like populism and distrust on the left and right of major financial institutions. Why is this? Because it's because people get the perception that the government is not their friend and it's instead the tool of like major banks and that it's not serving their own best interests. And what that means is that like you allow for sort of like extremism to take hold in both political parties. And we tell you that you can see like a sort of a link between these kinds of, real like major bailouts of financial institutions and sort of the rise with like sort of like political extremism. And if you look at this, you can directly see like a link between 2008 financial crisis and the rise of like, people like Donald Trump in politics and general like overall populist sentiment in politics. Because before this, you can see like the Republican Party was like the party that wanted to do something different with the government, like small government, etc. But now, as a result of this 2008 financial crisis and this major bailout, it became more of a party about like wanting to tear the government down as a whole. And it's important to note that like when you have sort of like general government distrust, that's just not good for like civic engagement and all kinds of stuff. Because the government does do a lot of important things. Look at, for example, SNAP benefits and how the recent shutdown of the government meant that like millions of people were cut off from their access to SNAP benefits. And that you always want a world in which you have people like who are generally like more trustful and more receptive, more responsive to their government. This is an example like of a larger trend of sort of U.S. federal government bailout of financial institutions, and when they let them get off like relatively scot-free, it means that everyday people begin to sort of build up a vendetta against the government because they get this impression that the government is not a tool for like of like enacting change for the to make the life of the everyday American better, but instead a way to like bail out major financial institutions to not really help me at all because I'm still losing my house either way. So why do I care if the government gets a bailout? And instead, what that means is that you allow for this extremism to take root. And we tell you that first and most importantly is that you don't want this because preventing like political polarization is a prerequisite to kind of any government action at all. Because if you have people who are so inherently distrustful and divided, then you have no like real government action at all, and you can't pass any kind of policy at all, which means that you're inherently like limiting the government's capacity to do anything, with regards to like SNAP benefits, stuff like that, but also to like act in favor of like preventing further financial crises. So you see more financial crises in an opposition world. Um, with that being said, some quick weighing analysis. We think it's important to note that, like, according to the framework and also just like who really gets affected by these things, you should always focus on which side most acutely benefits the average everyday American. And side government always wins on that point. So thank you very much, Cast Government Ballot.
Okay. I'm Elias. LO. I don't have a CT independent. Okay. Um, wait, quickly off time. Um, I'm just gonna go my case, top of case, their case. Just like that. Issues. Yeah, okay. Okay. My first contention is on recession. First subpoint economic harms. Quick recap. Unemployment was at like 10%. It was climbing. If the government didn't do anything, it would have continued to climb. Foreclosure, millions of homeowners were losing homes. There would have been more if nothing happened. Stock market plummeted. People who were retiring lost their pensions, lost their investments, and they were essentially going to get screwed. Now, why do we solve? Gov wants to think we didn't or nothing happened, but just because we didn't give money individually to people doesn't mean we didn't benefit them. There's just something called like a cascading effect or a snowball, where it's kind of a link chain. When you have more employment, people can't pay their mortgages, more foreclosure, then more like banks do even worse. So then they stop lending money. People can't withdraw any money. Like bosses can't pay their employees, and then more unemployment. And it's like a loop chain. You can draw like all of like many of these, where essentially, if you don't do anything to stabilize the banks, what happens is that like it would have gotten way worse because it would have just like snowballed. And to that extent, we do something to help them. Whereas in their world, they do nothing. The counterfactual like doesn't provide anything to like actually help people on the ground. Probably nothing would have happened to help people. It would have been way worse, and they probably would have taken way longer to like solve. So two major impacts here. Number one, like people would just be like more homeless. It'd be like weaker economically, like starving, just like bad things for the average American. But the second impact brings me to my second subpoint, political harms. You're going to get like massive political backlash if you don't help people. And of course, we prove that you help people and you help the banks to an extent. when people get hurt, like the government needs to step in, because if people's life gets worse and the government chooses not to fix it, it breeds resentment insofar as the government had the capacity to do something and they did nothing for like, especially for like this idea of like moral hazard. Like the average person would never buy this and it'd lead to even more populism. And especially when the effects would worsen, the snowball effect I just brought up, it would be way, way worse. So like two situations could play out. Number one, more moderate, is like general government mistrust. We also link into like populism and negative benefits here, or harms, not negative benefits here. And most likely, like people would start hating the government in like even more in our world because they had the ability to do something and did nothing. And like second possible situation is just like full on revolution, which is just the high end. Because if you get like people who like completely think the government has abandoned them and they're all homeless because they can't pay their homes and their bosses and they're all unemployed and there's nothing they're doing to help it, chances are we get like a total revolution, or at least some sort of massive political violence and revolting in the streets, which leads to even more economic instability. Okay. With that out of the way, those are like the general harms to the average American. Contention two is a little bit deeper and a little bit more like meta of like precedent. My first subpoint here is like the role of the banks. First, I'm going to do analysis on like why is America so successful? Number one, banks are really liberal with how they distribute currency. I was going like it leads to massive economic growth when you're sending out a lot of money to a lot of different like companies to invest, right? I point you towards like their example of like the Silicon Valley Bank. It probably went out because one of the corporations that they lent to failed. But if you set that precedent, what happens is you just stop lending to a lot of corporations that could be really good, that could lead to massive advancements. That's a net negative for the average American person. Here, I'd also like to bring up something that like FDR did like way back during the Great Depression, which is like FDIC, which essentially says like the average American, if there's a bank run, they only like their money is insured pretty much. They get it back from the federal government. I think this helps mitigate a lot of harms from bank runs, which is really, really important. So like what happens if you affirm still under like role of the banks and like why they'll distribute way less currency? We tell you on like financial liquidity, they need to hold on to money because banks go bankrupt if they don't have the money to cover their losses. And you don't want banks to hold on to money for literally nothing, just in case. That's a bad thing to happen because if they just hold on money, then no one can benefit from it. You have like more economic stagnation and like less innovation. You don't want banks holding on to money in case of economic crashes. That's a bad thing. And that's the precedent they set. Second, like thing on like precedent is loss of geopolitical power. America loses power in their world because number one, banks can no longer be trusted because we know the federal government does not have will not step in to help anyone. I think this is probably really, really bad because then like country or like foreign countries will now look to another really strong economic like thing to trust in the sense of like a strong currency or like a bank to store in. Maybe it's Switzerland, probably like China is what it's going to be, right? So America loses a lot of its geopolitical power because their banks are no longer seen as strong. So you don't really want to like invest with them anymore. You don't really want to bank with them anymore. Lose a lot of your power as like the world's currency. Like having like being like the global currency is really, really strong as well. You're losing that. You're losing general geopolitical power, probably to another country. This power is really, really good for the average American because you can negotiate better trade deals, have better allies, and generally disincentivize conflict that would hurt you. All of these things happen in their world because you no longer have the strong backbone of the banks, and the banks are why America is so successful. Okay, I'm gonna go on to refute it. First contention on moral hazards. We tell you like we just reject this whole framing of actually. Yeah. Okay. Never mind. Yeah. Actually, no. I'm saying sorry. First contention on moral hazard. We tell you we just like wholly reject this idea that like banks should not engage in risky behavior. We think it's generally a good thing, and it's what helps America be so dominant. Is that banks act aggressively to distribute money to the rest of the population, and they know okay if we make a bad investment, that's not the worst thing in the world because we can get bailed out to a large extent. By the way, these bailouts only happen in a very, very large extent. Also. I reject the notion that like there was no negative effect from banks like being from like after like 2008. They learned number one that no bank is too big to fail, and there were consequences. Yeah.
Can you tell me about what happened to Bear Stearns after the 2008 financial crisis?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would. But generally, I'm not familiar with that specific example, but my guess would be that generally you lose a lot of distrust from the people. It's a net negative. but like generally, we think it outweighs even if something doesn't happen. So you teach the banks restraint, and you like, yeah, without them collapsing and dying. We think that's probably unnecessary. Yeah, again, but okay, on this like Silicon Valley example, we think like, right, that's a good example of like what modernly happens when an investment fails. Number one, people try to withdraw their money, but then it's backed by the FDIC. Those people get their money back. These banks, hopefully, in a large area or like something like the Silicon Valley, hopefully these banks would then get bailed out and they can continue to invest in countries. I think Silicon Valley tech investment is really, really strong. And we don't just want the biggest companies or the ones with already stable financials to get investments. We want all companies to get investments so we can get maximum innovation and maximum competition. Second contention on public distrust. We first of all, we reject this idea of like more banks equals more competition. I think this is like not necessarily true. We think competition happens in the status quo. I point you towards Fidelity, which emerged mostly after 2008 to the largest extent. It's an online banking platform, which is what I use. There's no there's no like brick and mortar buildings, so they charge like zero ATM fees, and pretty much that makes it so they're more competitive, and they bring down ATM fees for everyone else. Competition happens in either world. Number two, there's probably not that much innovation to happen with bank, and the trade-off you're getting when you're giving up innovation of all the other fields because there's no more money being spread around because they feel conservative is probably way, way worse. We think like, yeah, it's probably true that they did like not a whole lot to alleviate the financial cost of like homeowners. They did something, but like our opponents do nothing. So it's at least better in our world, and we do help to some extent. I've already warranted this. Also, I reject this notion that like populism emerged because of this. Donald Trump blamed the immigrants, right? You can blame anyone. This is kind of like the idea of populism is you choose a scapegoat. As long as it makes some sort of sense, it'll probably work anyways. I reject that this is like a unique link into populism. Yeah, thus I oppose.
Okay. Have a sip of water. Everyone ready? Awesome. My time begins now. I want to start on two really important observations on the government side about what's going on in this round. Then I'm going to talk about the government case, then the opposition case. Firstly, two massively important observations about what's going on this round. Firstly and foremost is what Ian tells you in the first like 30 seconds of his speech, which is that the government world is not a world in which the US government does literally nothing. At the time in 2008, the main opinions were, do you either bail out these banks or do you engage in active regulation, active restructuring, and breaking up these big banks? The world of the government side is not a world where the government throws up their hands and does nothing. Rather, it's a world where the government actively goes out and restructures and breaks up banks. Throughout this entire speech, I'm going to be explaining why that's better. It's really important to stress at the top, whenever side opposition talks about the government doing nothing, that's a mischaracterization of what
POC
is. Yeah, of course.
Just to be clear, your plan doesn't say anything about like helping people themselves, like giving out aid. It's just like this thing about like regulation and breaking up banks, correct?
I mean, we're talking about what we think would have happened in history. There's no.
No, I know that. I'm saying like that's your counter narrative.
Yes, that's what we think is the counterfactual. Okay, time resumes now. Okay. Secondly, and importantly, just like historical accuracy on 2008 crisis here. Side opposition talks a lot about risk, and we agree. Look, banks can take on some amount of risk, but there's a difference between calculated risk and what was happening in the 2008 financial crisis. This is really, 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 really important, which is that what was happening in the 2008 financial crisis was not banks making a reasonable, educated, risky bet that went bad. What happened in the 2008 financial crisis was a massive bundle in which banks were bundling together mortgage bonds on essentially nothing from buyers who had no hope of repaying them, bundling them together and then getting them AAA rated from ratings agencies and selling them for orders of magnitude more than they were actually worth. What happened in 2008 was not an example of banks engaging in calculated risk. What happened in 2008 was an example of banks engaging in wild speculation of financial assets that had no real backing or value behind them. Yeah, of course.
Would you say that banks act less risky now than they did in 2008?
Oh, absolutely not. I just think we haven't seen the consequences of that. You guys don't even talk about what Ian tells you about private credit industries. More on that in a second. But we've just built a new terrible gambling financial systems that are bound to bite us. I don't know which year it'll be, but soon enough. Okay, first contention on I'm going to go gov case first. First contention on government side here is about moral hazard. My opponents, first of all, importantly, what I was just talking about with top of case. When my opponents talk about the idea that banks shouldn't engage in risky behavior, I think that that's not an accurate assessment of what was happening in 2008. We agree banks take calculated risk, but what happened in 2008 was not that. Secondly, and importantly, on this idea that banks did actually hurt, that the banks did have negative effects. I want to be clear. I don't hold it against anyone for not knowing about Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns was huge before 2008, and it doesn't really exist anymore. So that begs the question. What actually did happen to Bear Stearns after 2008? And the answer is the government basically made Bear Stearns be acquired by JP Morgan Chase, which is to say, yeah, it was bad individually for Bear Stearns, but the government didn't actually restructure anything individually. And importantly, the government furthered the monopoly of a different bank that was also engaging in risky loan practices. Yeah, it was bad for Bear Stearns, but JP Morgan Chase got off entirely scot-free with, in fact, even more market dominance than they had before the crisis even started. That's not what negative consequences on the biggest banks look like. The general theme here with the opposition responses to the government case is that they point out a really specific way in which it might not work this, but don't engage with the larger framing that when this happened, it was good for big banks who weren't really hurt by it, even if Lehman Brothers went under and Bear Stearns got acquired by JP Morgan Chase. Thirdly, and importantly on this first contention, everything Ian tells you about private credit is entirely dropped. That the private credit industries of today are getting even more increasingly risky, even more increasingly taking on loans that look a lot like 2008 and becoming an even more key piece of our financial economy. They are going to fail at some point, and when they do, it's going to be a disaster. The fact that we don't have a financial system that can regulate them, and the fact that the private credit companies feel comfortable taking on this risk is a direct product of the fact that they were bailed out in 2008. Now, moving on to second contention about public distrust. My opponents talk about how more banks doesn't necessarily equal more competition. They talk about how there's other banks. Yeah, look, there are other banks that aren't just the four big banks of JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. But those are by far the most dominant banks. They have a massive monopoly over the industry, which lets them take on huge risk. When you have more banks, they obviously have to compete with each other. They have to actually provide the best consumer service. At the end of the day, we want our banks to actually serve the well-being of the American people. And you can only have that if you actually have competition and different banks. But the historical precedent is that the government made Bear Stearns be acquired by JP Morgan Chase. They increased the monopolies of these banks. In the long run, too, we're also way better for homeowners because when we have this restructuring, when we have less massive financial risk, we mean that homeowners are much less likely to lose their homes in the future. Finally, on this idea of populism, look, the government side in this round is not contending whatsoever that the only cause of the rise in populism was the 2008 financial crisis. Obviously, that's not true. There are many different causes for the rise in populism on both the left and the right in the present day state of the United States. But the 2008 financial crisis was a significant cause of it. It still gets talked about by politicians today. That when the government took a stand to defend JP Morgan Chase and not homeowners, then it was going to be a disaster. When the government said we're not going to punish these banks for their risky practices, obviously people are going to lose trust in the government. Now, moving on to responding to the opposition case. On their first contention about recession. First and foremost, they agree that the bailouts didn't really help regular people. What they said and talk about is the cycle in which when we create better banking systems, people end up living better lives and having more money. Which is true, but the economy needs to look to the long term, not just the short term. The thesis of GovCase isn't that we aren't going to have people hurt for a little bit. Yes, it's going to take time to restructure. Yes, it's going to take a little bit of time to do that. But the point is that once you do that, you build an economic system that can last into the future because it forces banks to act responsibly and compete with each other. In the long run, this is always going to lead to more employment, better wages, more home ownership, and just better lives for everyday people. Secondly, no, thank you. I have a lot to get through. Secondly, is that banks recover fairly quickly, especially with regulation. When you have the government who's stepping in, regulating, splitting up these banks, the people in the treasury are some of the smartest economists in the world. They're not going to be stupid about how they're breaking it up. The idea that this isn't going to take that long. There's going to be a short extra period of hurt in the government world, which didn't happen in the world we lived in. Totally agree. And then after that, we have a new system that's way better and isn't having the risks and problems that we are undertaking and experiencing in the status quo. Second thing on idea of political backlash here. I think it's really important that most people haven't heard of these cycles. That like what they want to see if you're a regular person who loses money, what you want to see is justice as opposed to giving money to the people who hurt them. This is true regardless of the actual economics, which we're winning on, but we turn the entirety of this argument about political backlash because people don't want to see the big banks get money. They want to see the big banks get punished for hurting themselves. That's what causes distrust. Second contention here on precedent. I think this is absolutely not true for the reasons I outlined at the beginning of my speech, which is that banks weren't just being liberal with their money. They were being insane with their money. That's a huge difference. When my opponents talk about how banks will not save some money to not go under, what they mean is banks will be responsible with their money and take on reasonable risks. This is good. More competition also turns this because then even if individual banks aren't as strong collectively, when they compete with each other, the collective US banking system does become much stronger. On the idea of geopolitical power, first of all, the 2008 crisis was terrible for the US geopolitically. When you have massive crises, it makes the whole world lose trust in you. But secondly, the average person doesn't necessarily care how well the US stacks up against China at like a deep financial level, nor does it affect their lives. What's most important is like, can you buy a home in this round? I urge a government ballot.
All right, so let me just pull up my timer and then I will start my time if everyone's ready on my first word. Hey Judge, my name is Gordy Kenyon. I'm the second speaker for this motion. Real quick, all I'm gonna do is like top of case, and then I'm gonna go into their refutations to our case, and then our their refutations to their refutations. Okay, so first, um, we don't mean like necessarily the whole point about our case is that we know that the stuff that happened during the 2008 crisis alleviated the damages that were done. So like as much as they want to argue to you that it's like unfathomably terrible and all banks are terrible like and taking increasingly risky deals, like we know that what was done helps. They don't actually have like any form of, they don't have the same degree of probability that we do for some level of benefit to the people. In fact, I'll get into how they don't actually have that much warranting for how their stuff helps later into their case, but at least we know for a fact demonstrably that what me and Elias have worked to save the people. Now, um, like there's still going to like the whole point about like the some level of mistrust, like the banks are still going to be taking like banks taking risky decisions, not banks being insane, like is wrong. And the reason is wrong is because fundamentally the one lesson that banks need, and like I'll get into the whole like private credit industry now, to know that they can't go that far, they can't go as far as they did during the 2008 recession, is that they couldn't do it. Like that is the lesson they need. And that's the lesson they need for a couple of reasons. First, public distrust. So like they keep talking about how people hate banks. And like we're not disagreeing with them. You can hate banks all you want as a person. I'm sure
Yeah,
that a
see.
lot of people did. Accepted?
Like where on the flow is this? Like what are you
This is
responding to?
this is general top of case to your thing about banks acting crazy and mistrust to banks.
Okay, got it.
So like the consequence, and I'm reading this now because I'm going to use it a lot to refute my opponent's case. The consequence to these banks was people not trusting them in the government. Like they have this stain on their reputation, which will then impact how they act later in life. Okay, now let's go into the refutations to our case. Okay, first, their point about like the refutations to our case one about recession. Okay, so like first, their whole like the start of their case is about like long-term economic stability and competition. Like that's how they refuted our case. Except this is wrong fundamentally because there is no long-term insofar as there is no guarantee that what they're saying works, insofar as it is a gamble with the US economy. So, like, will there be a recession? Will there not be a recession? We don't know. Like, will it continue? Will it not continue? We don't know. There is no long term. Just because, like, if your ship is sinking, you need to get the people off the ship, not try to patch it up and be like, hey, we can keep sailing if we patch up our ship properly. Like, no, that's not what you do. We need to prioritize stopping where we are and saving people when we can, instead of doing this thing where it's like, hey, maybe if we take this and this risk, like they want to talk about the banks taking insane risks. Well, that's what their side is advocating for. Like maybe if we take so and so risk, then it'll fix the economy in a way that'll make it more sustainable for the future. Is not the attitude that we should be looking at this for. Because if that fails, like they keep talking about, all it does is hurt the people more. So like, yeah, insofar as there is zero proof as to what they're saying could work. So like it is all purely speculation. And as much as my teammate loves Sam Worthington, I don't think we should be using him as like the pinnacle of economic investment and like how we should manage our economy. Like there is zero reason for us to trust that side as to how likely their benefits are. Like they can give you a lot of great examples. Like I'm not an economics guru. These are my worst kinds of topics. Like I do not know a lot about the examples they're bringing up. But at the same time, I do know that my opponents are not the pinnacle of economics and should not be the ones in charge of making decisions for our economy. Then they talk about how like people have not heard of these like infinite cycles and all they want to do is see justice for banks. But like indirectly here, they're outlining for you the consequences that these banks face. And it's that people are angry. And like, while, okay, I can't come to you with statistics about how banks maybe did worse and all of these things. And because of the huge job growth that we saw under like the next presidency after 2008, like whatever, there's so many different factors that happened. But like, there's a really huge correlation between people not trusting banks and banks' lives being harder. It's like they keep arguing to you that people hate banks with a passion. And I say they're right. But like, that's the consequence. They keep talking about how there was no consequence to these banks and JP Morgan grew. And from a standpoint, like from a way of thinking, that's true. They did incorporate some other banks into like, they did absorb some other banks. But at the same time, the public backlash they faced and the amount of hate that they still get from the US public is the consequence that we were worrying about. And is the consequence that banks are worrying about. Okay, response to C2. Like this whole thing about how banks were insane with their money. Like, first of all, banks need fundamentally, not like educated risks is like this weird thing they don't really outline for you. Like there's no clear definitions on their side of like what's educated and what's not educated. Like banks failed. We're not disputing this. But at the same time, they learned from that failure, right? So like again, they keep outlining for you that these banks are like tanking and they're terrible people. And like all these risks that they keep taking are like collapsing them to the ground. But that 2008 recession is like an isolated incident. Like banks have not led us into another like instability crisis with like buying mortgage bonds and being risky about it since then. Like through that, like considering the fact that empirically it has not failed and all of their impacts still have not triggered, and like they do not have a clear time frame at all. So all they're really saying to you is like, hey, banks are still risky, and like in the future, I don't know when, like on some random day, which isn't even me twisting their words. That's a Sam Worthington quote. Like in the future, from this round, I'm not my partner. From this round, Sam literally tells you that it will happen sometime in the future. He doesn't know when, he doesn't know how. So, like,
POI,
accepted?
if I'm an economist in 2006 and I say, you know what, maybe the mortgage bonds are going to collapse at some point in the future, should everybody just not listen to me because I don't have a specific date?
No, but at the same time, I'm sure that the most credible economists also come with reasoning and definitions of what is an insane risk and what's not an insane risk and why it's going to happen and when it's going to, like for anything other than like, hey, trust me, banks are being risky. It'll happen later. Like, really, that's not specific or in no way, shape, or form relevant to this debate enough for us to consider in any form of refutations. Okay, now, let's get into some refutations to their case. Okay, so first, let's look at this moral hazard. So like they can't run a precedent case about the moral hazard of having the US government bail out banks, but also say that they only specifically dislike the 2008 bailout. That's not how that works. That's a contradiction. If they try to argue to you that bailouts holistically are not bad, but this specific bailout sets a bad precedent for the government to do the same thing in the future, that does not sit well. Because fundamentally, they cannot argue to you that bailouts are good, but 2008 is bad, and that 2008 sets a bad precedent for how bailout should be done. So, like, fundamentally, either disregard top of case or disregard this contention. Judge's discretion. But at the same time, assuming that contradiction was not there, okay, so like, look, they talk about how these banks are like too big to fail, and so like how all of these banks collapse, but that didn't happen. They did fail, and that is the lesson they need to know, that there is no more of these like huge strides and like jumps from point A to point B from these banks without making at least some level of an educated decision. And that's why since 2008 there has been no recession, like despite the fact that Donald Trump is bringing us closer. Like these signs of a recession have not come from risky activity from banks. They come from god awful decisions by our president. But that's completely irrelevant to this debate, so I'm going to stay off that. And now to their C2. Public distrust. We turn this. Public distrust turns because if at least what the government did at that point in time helps. And what real public distrust comes from is if I can't buy a house, I can't afford food, and the economy is tanking, and the government just like isn't doing anything. They're like, hey, let's try to restructure banks with no clear outline plan. Because unfortunately, that's what the other side is bringing you. Like no parameters about what they're actually doing. And just saying, hey, we're going to restructure banks and they're going to be better. Like, sure, I can say that something's going to be better, but if I don't have a plan or any warning as to how it's going to be better, then obviously you're not going to listen to me. So, like, as a homeowner, as somebody or not, as somebody who's not a homeowner who's like suffering the economic downsides from that, that's where real public distrust comes from. Because like, I'm starving. I can't buy a house. Like I'm on the streets. I now hate the government because insofar as they have the ability to do something, which like obviously the people in 2008 didn't know would work for sure, but I'm sure somebody at least at some point spread some information about how bailing out banks would in some way help. So insofar as the government can do something, but if they choose not to, and if they choose to do Sam's risky plan that has no warranting outlined for whether it's going to work or not, then the public gets more and more angry, and the public distrust actually rises. Okay, so yeah, that's my time.
Okay. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. I'll begin my time now. Insofar as Gov's entire advocacy consists of dropping all my short-term benefits and then turning around and saying to vote for this plan they spend maybe 30 seconds of time on, the debate couldn't have been clearer for op. Let's start on this plan they give you. Nico tells you, and it's true when he says, we don't know what this is. It's a low probability of success. Like, what is this restructuring? How do they solve? How does any of this work? None of it is explained, right? Like, we don't even know. It's like a 30-second like part of their speech that they try to impact out to like solving everything. To the extent that they don't explain any of this, and it's too late to like flesh out a plan in the PMR, you have to vote for op. Because at least we give you something. We tell you, look, we were able to make the economy recover in a decently short period of time. We were able to like do some decent short-term impacts and help people, but they just give you this thing about restructuring. Wait, I'm sorry. Someone say something. Wait. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Yeah. And to the extent that like they don't really give us anything there, you can't vote for them. They say restructuring, they say regulation. They never tell us what this regulation is. Like, look on the flow. What is the regulation? We don't know. Is it managing risk? Maybe, but we don't know. You can't vote for them on this. But for the purposes of this round, let's pretend like for the purposes of this speech, I'm gonna pretend that like all of their impacts are true. Let's go through it. Firstly, on populism, we tell you we win mainly on time frame. We have an instant link into populism. We never stop the cycle. People instantly get worse, and like there's instant revolution and like instant violence in the streets because they are quite literally starving, and there's nothing about civilian relief in their counter narrative. Okay, so like instantly we get populist impacts, we get revolution, we get political violence, which could probably stop the government from functioning in the future, probably see massive overhauls. The world or the country wouldn't have turned out what it like it would today. Wait, pausing my time. Is everything okay? Is there wait, am I crazy?
No, I just
Yeah,
saw.
sorry, I accidentally unmuted.
Oh, okay. All right, I'm at 1:55. I'm gonna resume my time. Yeah, to the extent that even if their populism is true, that it did link majorly into like Donald Trump and the left-wing rise of populism as well, that's only a later thing, and it's probably mitigated by the fact that like there wasn't that like people didn't like the harm in the 2008 crisis isn't as bad as it could have been. Okay. Second, on like short-term benefits, Sam kind of concedes this. He glosses over it and says, well, look, like it's probably like banks recover fairly quickly anyways, and the new system is probably better anyway. So it's like it's an okay thing to happen. But I tell you, no, he doesn't get to go away with this and drop my entire analysis about cycles. I tell you about the snowball effect, and then he just clean drops it, which makes it true. I tell you, look, when the banks can't, like concisely, I tell you is like when bosses can't get any money out of the banks because like no one is paying their mortgages, they can't pay their employees. Employees like don't get any money, they can't pay their mortgages, and it's a cycle. And the economy never recovers until you give them this instant cash injection to solve. And they never contend with this, which means it's true. This is straight dropped analysis, which wins us the round because it means their government probably never recovers enough to even implement whatever plan they have, assuming it has any sort of solvency, which it doesn't, right? Because they can see the short-term benefit of like America gets kind of turned into all this unrest where like people keep getting poorer, unemployment keeps going up, like banks never fully recover, they drop all this, and to the extent that there is some sort of populism, some sort of violence in the streets, I challenge the fact that the U.S. would have ever recovered in their world. It probably wouldn't have, and that's the truth. So what do they have? What are they probably going to bring up in their next speech? They're going to try to like explain all their arguments with this main plan. But the truth is, we don't know if this plan ever would have worked. We don't know if there's political will for this plan. We don't know anything. They never warrant why this plan was going to be the most likely. They say, well, this was the two things people were choosing between. Why? How? What? Like, this is never warranted at all. This is just analysis from Sam and his partner that we never get from. So there's nothing to vote on for them because that's the prereq to all their arguments. And to the extent that the US probably never would have recovered due to populism and due to like the snowball effect, which is like half of which is dropped, they never get any of the impacts of their plan anyways. I oppose.
Okay. Quick off-time roadmap. I'm gonna go sort of like top of case, some couple responses into some points of clash, and then onto our collapse and our way. Sorry, give me one second. Okay, so time starts now. All right, I quickly want to address a seeming contradiction that side opposition points out in our case. They talk sort of about how like in my first speech we mentioned that we're just opposing this specific, 2008 financial bailout, but then we're saying like, oh, like it sets a precedent for all bailouts. What we're saying here is that like our burden of proof as side government is only to show that this specific bailout is bad. It may be that all financial bailouts are bad, but like that's not the scope of this debate, and that's not what this debate is about. And more importantly, that this specific, major bailout is the one we're still talking about today, and this is the one that set this precedent. Um, hmm, yeah, moving on. All right. So, first point of clash. We hear the word solvency thrown around a lot in this round. But to me, when you solve a problem, you prevent that problem from arising again. And side opposition fundamentally cannot do that. And additionally, like they mentioned they have like immediate solvency with regards to like, stopping the financial crisis. I don't think they really like, solved it. Like I don't think they handled the problem with like incredible efficacy. Like yeah, like, like it eventually sort of got handled, but like, people died. Like millions, like so many people lost their mortgages, lost their homes. So many people were homeless on the street, starving to death. Like I wouldn't, call that like a perfect solve. And more importantly, they're not solving the problem because they're not like preventing it from happening again. When you solve a problem, you get rid of any potential like harms in the future. And they're not doing that at all, Judge. When you build a house on a volcano and the volcano erupts, the strategy is not to just build another house and say it already erupted once, it's not going to erupt again. The strategy is to build a house somewhere else, Judge. All right. Next on like political distrust and political backlash. Like which side has sort of, more political distrust and like public backlash? Like in which side do you see that more? Side op is the status quo, in which like millions of people suffered very extensively due to that crash. And what Sam tells you in his speech is that like like, the average person's financial knowledge doesn't extend as far as like these complex like economic cycles and ramifications. But what they do see is that they're suffering, they're losing their house, and keep in mind that this happened in like for real in the status quo. I'm suffering, like I lost my life savings, I'm losing my house, and what is the government doing? Instead of passing like some crazy act, $700 billion for JP Morgan to buy Bear Stearns and further JP Morgan's economic like financial dominance. How is that in any way helping me? And so regardless of like even if you sort of buy this really like complex like cycles argument, that's like insofar as people like as what people see happening is the government bailing out these banks and not them, you're going to see political distrust even if you buy that argument. And then third, on the idea of like, how much risks should a bank take? I think like opposition continually strawmans like just how risky these investments were. These weren't just, calculated risk. Banks were like handing out willy-nilly housing loans to people who had no capacity and no intention of paying back these loans. And on the idea that, like they didn't walk off scot-free because they got like penalized and people hate banks. First of all, banks are like the big four banks are the big four banks. Like even if you hate the bank, you still need to use the bank. So that didn't stop anything. JP Morgan is still like I think the largest asset manager in the entire world, managing tens of trillions of dollars, and it's like it's not even close at all. And secondly, you like note that our private credit example and analysis goes completely unresponded to by side opposition throughout this entire round because they have no response to it because banks were emboldened by this. They know like the U.S. federal government is going to come and like save my butt whenever I do something bad. So the private credit industry is continuing to hand out loans to people who are irresponsible and cannot pay them back. And you see this with that like stuff like like buy now pay later with like stuff like Klarna, etc. And there's no future proofing done inside opposition. So that means that even if you buy their argument, like they have some immediate solvency, the cycle is going to keep occurring and occurring and occurring. And so you always prefer a side government world because even if you buy, side ops argument that like we might not have a crazy immediate solvency, which we do, we still prevent this from happening in the long run and in the long term. And so you inherently always prefer side government because at worst, both sides have a financial crash. Like that is an irrefutable fact, but we prevent any more from happening. Um, Sorry, one more thing. I just got a little bit messed up with my notes here. And then, secondly, on the idea of like a political backlash, look back to the analysis we give you in, I think, our contention to and public distrust about how preventing political polarization is a prerequisite to passing any kind of governmental action. And so, because you see so much, public distrust and public disengagement in an opposition world, then you prevent any kind of government action. And so you further impede the way for the government to actually help people out, and you further make it difficult for the government to have any actual solvency. And so, if you want solvency for like these average everyday Americans who are the folks that are around according to the framework and according to the weighing mechanism, then you always prefer a governmental ballot. Thank you very much, Judge. I cannot be happier to support.
Thank you guys. That was a great round.
Okay. This is like the best case for me. It's like economic knowledge.
I hate econ topics so much. This is so bad for me.
I thought that was a fun round. I've always wanted to debate that. However it goes, I'm really glad that. So I actually got the chance to debate that motion.
Yeah, great round, guys. Great round to watch. We'll be back in a few minutes with the decision.